officer, he does not have a valid first-class ticket, and he's creating a disturbance for the other guests.
Sir, stand up for me, please. If you don't, you're going to be removed from the aircraft.
I'm in the seat printed on my ticket. It's right here. The ticket's legitimate.
Last chance, sir.
At 010, flight attendant Sarah Collins, employee number 47821, with 7 years of the airline, walked through first class and stopped cold when she saw Michael Reynolds, a black man in seat 2A. She approached him aggressively, accused him of stealing someone else's seat, and demanded to see his boarding pass in a tone she never used with white passengers. When Reynolds showed her his boarding pass, proving it paid $1,400 for the first-class ticket, she called it fraudulent and summoned airport security to have him forcibly removed from the aircraft. Security officer Jake Morrison boarded the aircraft, reviewed Reynolds' valid first-class boarding pass, and nevertheless sided with the flight attendant, questioning why Reynolds was causing a disturbance and suggesting the ticket could be fake. Ignoring multiple passengers who stated Reynolds had been seated quietly reading, Morrison ordered him to stand up immediately or face physical removal. When Captain Dennis Hart emerged from the cockpit, he also immediately backed his flight attendant, all because Michael Reynolds was black. What they didn't know was that they had just racially profiled a federal agent with 15 years of counterterrorism experience, that their coordinated lies about Reynolds being disruptive were being destroyed by video evidence from multiple witnesses, and that their decision to remove a black man from first class based purely on the color of skin would end with a $1.2 million lawsuit, 3 destroyed careers, and a viral video with 50 million views that will become a case study in corporate racism. Before going further, the script asks what city or country you're watching from and tells viewers to drop in the comments, adding that they love seeing where people are tuning in from. It then says that if you believe paying for a first-class ticket while black shouldn't result in being removed from a plane, then like the video and subscribe. Michael Reynolds had boarded Flight 2847 from Atlanta to Washington, D.C. at 6:45 a.m., 45 minutes before scheduled departure. At 42 years old, Reynolds was an FBI special agent assigned to the Counterterrorism Division, returning from a week-long assignment coordinated with field offices across the Southeast. He carried a black leather laptop bag containing classified briefing materials, which was why he always flew first class on work trips, because the privacy allowed him to review sensitive documents without shoulder surfers. He'd paid for seat 2A with his personal credit card, $1,400 for the 3-hour flight, because bureau policy didn't cover premium seating, even when handling top-secret intelligence. Reynolds settled into the window seat wearing khakis, a navy polo shirt, and a blazer. He pulled out his tablet, opened an encrypted report about emerging domestic terrorism threats, and began reading. Other first-class passengers boarded, a businessman in 1A scrolling through his phone, an elderly couple in row 3 getting comfortable, and a woman in 2C already asleep with neck pillow. Reynolds didn't look up because he learned years ago that existing while black in premium spaces often drew unwanted attention. So he kept to himself, stayed professional, and hoped for an uneventful flight. At 7:15 a.m., Sarah Collins started her pre-flight walkthrough. She'd been a flight attendant for 7 years and had worked herself into a comfortable routine in the first-class cabin, and she knew the kind of passengers who belonged there, business executives, wealthy retirees, and frequent flyers she recognized. When she reached row 2 and saw Reynolds, she stopped mid-stride, a black man in first class, dressed casually, reading on a tablet, and her eyes narrowed with immediate suspicion. "Excuse me," Collins said sharply, standing over Reynolds with her arms crossed. "Can I see your boarding pass?" Reynolds looked up, slightly surprised. He'd been asked this question before on other flights, always by flight attendants who seemed confused by his presence in premium seating, but never this early in the boarding process. "Is there a problem?" he asked calmly. "I need to verify you're in the correct seat," Collins said, her tone carrying an edge that other passengers were starting to notice. The businessman in 1A glanced over, and the woman in 2C opened one eye. Reynolds reached into the seat pocket in front of him, pulled out his boarding pass, and handed it to Collins without argument. It clearly showed seat 2A, first class, Michael Reynolds confirmation number, paid ticket. Collins studied it like she was examining a counterfeit bill, turning it over, holding it up to the light, and checking the barcode. "Are you sure this is your ticket?" she finally asked. Reynolds felt a familiar tightness in his chest, The recognition that this was happening again, that his presence was being questioned, and that he was about to have to prove he belonged somewhere he'd pay to be. Yes, he said evenly. That's my assigned seat. I purchased that ticket. Did you pay for first class? Collins asked slowly. Or did you use an upgrade? The businessman in 1A shifted uncomfortably as it was getting awkward. I don't see how that's relevant, Reynolds said, keeping his voice measured. But I paid for my credit card. Full price. Collins's jaw tightened. First class is quite expensive. I just want to make sure there hasn't been some kind of mistake with the booking system. There's no mistake, Reynolds said firmly. I'm in my assigned seat with a valid paid ticket. May I please get back to my reading? Collins didn't move. She stood there holding his boarding pass, her mind clearly trying to find some angle, some justification for why this didn't seem right to her. Other passengers were watching now. The elderly woman in row 3 whispered something to her husband, and a man across the aisle pulled out his phone. Sir, Collins said coldly, I'm going to need to verify this with the gate agent. Please wait here. You have my boarding pass right in your hand, Reynolds said, his patience wearing thin but his tone still controlled. Everything is in order. There's nothing to verify. I'll be right back, Collins said, turning on her heel and walking toward the front galley. Reynolds watched her go, already knowing where this was headed. Thinking of the variations he'd been through before, the questions, the suspicion, the assumption that he must have done something wrong or dishonest to be sitting in first class. But today felt different, like Collins was going to push it further than usual. At the front of the plane, Collins picked up the intercom phone and called the gate. This is Sarah, first class attendant on flight 2847. I have a passenger in 2A who I need security to check out. The gate agent's voice crackled back. What's the issue? I think there might be a problem with this ticket, Collins said, lowering her voice, but not enough that Reynolds couldn't hear parts of the conversation from his seat. Does he have a boarding pass? Is it valid? Right name, right seat, right flight? Yes, but I don't think Sarah, if his boarding pass is valid. I'm not sure what you want to check. Collins bristled. Just send security. I have a feeling about this passenger. She hung up and returned to Reynolds, who was still seated calmly, still reading his tablet, still doing absolutely nothing wrong. Sir, Collins announced loud enough for the cabin to hear, security is coming to verify your ticket. Reynolds closed his tablet. Security is coming because I'm sitting in the seat I paid for. Security is coming because I requested verification. Verification of what? Reynolds asked. You've seen my boarding pass. It's valid. What exactly needs to be verified? The woman across the aisle spoke up. This is ridiculous. He showed you his ticket. Leave him alone. Collins shot her a look. Ma'am, this doesn't concern you. It concerns all of us. The businessman in 1A added. You're harassing a passenger who clearly has a valid ticket. I've been sitting right here. He's done nothing wrong. Collins's face flushed because she wasn't used to passengers challenging her, especially not in defense of someone she decided didn't belong. Everyone needs to stay out of this, she said firmly. Security will handle it. Reynolds sat back in his seat with his hands visible and his demeanor calm, knowing that when security arrived, this would either de-escalate or explode, and also knowing multiple passengers were now watching, some recording, and becoming witnesses to what was quickly turning into an obvious case of racial profiling. The plane was still at the gate. The door was open, and Sarah Collins had just made a decision that would cost her everything. Airport security officer Jake Morrison boarded the plane 3 minutes later with his hand already resting on his belt near his radio. He walked straight to row 2 where Sarah Collins stood waiting with her arms crossed, looking vindicated that backup had arrived. Morrison was a 10-year veteran of airport security and had responded to hundreds of passenger disputes, most of them exactly what he expected them to be. People who didn't want to follow rules. What's the problem here? Morrison asked, directing his question to Collins, not to Reynolds. Collins jumped in immediately. This passenger is refusing to leave his seat. Morrison turned to Reynolds with an expression that showed he'd already made up his mind about who was in the wrong. Sir, why are you causing problem? He asked, his tone already hostile. Reynolds looked up at the security officer and kept his voice calm and measured. I'm not causing a problem. I have a valid first-class boarding pass for this seat. This flight attendant has questioned my right to be here without any cause. He reached for his boarding pass, which Collins was still holding, took it from her hand, and offered it to Morrison. The security officer took it and glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds. The boarding pass clearly showed Reynolds' name, Seat 2A, first class, paid ticket, correct flight number. Everything was in order. That doesn't mean you get to argue with crew, Morrison said, handing the boarding pass back dismissively. Reynolds felt his jaw tighten but maintained his composure. I'm not arguing. I'm sitting in my assigned seat. I showed her my valid ticket. That should have been the end of it. Morrison's eyes narrowed. You people always say that, he said flatly. The businessman in 1A inhaled sharply, and the woman across the aisle who had been recording pulled her phone up higher to make sure she was getting on video. Several other passengers shifted in their seats, visibly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Collins saw her opportunity and took it. I believe there's been a mistake with his ticket, she said to Morrison. I don't think he actually paid for first class. Morrison nodded as if this confirmed everything. Then that's enough, he said. Reynolds stared at both of them. Enough for what? You just looked at my boarding pass. My name is on it. My seat assignment is correct. What mistake are you talking about? Morrison took a step closer, his body language shifting into something more threatening. Enough to remove you. Stand up now or this turns physical. The cabin went silent as passengers stopped their conversations, and more phones came out to record. Everyone could see what was happening, and everyone knew it was wrong. Collins pressed her advantage. He's been disruptive and refusing crew instructions, she announced to Morrison and to the cabin. Reynolds' calm finally cracked. That's not true, he said firmly. I've been sitting quietly reading since I boarded. Ask anyone here. Multiple passengers spoke up immediately. He hasn't done anything. A woman called out from row 4. She's lying, said the businessman in 1A. We've been watching the whole thing, another voice added. He's just been sitting there. Morrison held up his hand to silence them. I'm not asking passengers, he said sharply. Morrison's face hardened. Decisions made. Stand up now. The woman in 2C who had been recording held up her phone. I have video of everything, she said. He hasn't done anything wrong. He's been sitting in his seat the entire time. Morrison turned to her with a look that made her lean back. Put the phone down or you'll be next, he threatened. Reynolds couldn't believe what he was hearing. You're ignoring witnesses? He asked Morrison. You're ignoring video evidence. Morrison's face hardened. Decisions made. Stand up now. That's when Captain Dennis Hart emerged from the cockpit. He was in his mid-50s with silver hair and a uniform that carried the authority of 30 years of flying. He walked into the first-class cabin and immediately looked at Collins. What's going on back here? He asked. Collins turned to the captain like she'd been waiting for reinforcement. This passenger is refusing to cooperate with crew instructions, she said. Hart looked at Reynolds, then at Morrison, then back at Collins, and he didn't ask Reynolds for his side of the story. Didn't ask to see the boarding pass, and didn't ask any of the passengers who were actively telling him Reynolds had done nothing wrong. He made his decision based entirely on the word of his flight attendant. Sir, Hart said to Reynolds, his voice carrying the weight of final authority. If my crew member has asked you to deplane, I need you to comply. Reynolds felt something cold settle in his chest as the flight attendant, the security officer, and now the captain had all sided against him without evidence, without investigation, and without even pretending to care about the truth. On what grounds? Reynolds asked. I have a valid ticket. I violated no rules. I've been sitting quietly in my assigned seat. Hart's expression didn't change. Failure to comply with crew instructions is ground for removal. What instruction have I failed to comply with? Reynolds asked, his voice rising slightly but still controlled. She asked to see my boarding pass. I showed it to her. She asked if I paid for my seat. I answered. Then she called security, claiming there was a problem when there is no problem. I haven't refused anything because I haven't been given any lawful instruction to refuse. The businessman in 1A stood up. Captain, I've been sitting right here the entire time. This gentleman has done absolutely nothing wrong. Your flight attendant approached him differently than she approached every white passenger in this cabin. This is racial profiling. The woman, still recording her phone, spoke up. I have the whole thing on video. She never asked anyone else to prove they belonged in first class. Only him. Another passenger chimed in. This is discrimination. We all see it. You're about to remove a man for sitting in a seat he paid for. Captain Hart raised his voice. Everyone needs to calm down. This is my aircraft, and I make the final decisions about who stays and who goes. Reynolds reached up to the overhead bin and pulled down his laptop bag, and Morrison tensed with his hand moving toward his belt. But Reynolds wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was reaching for his FBI credentials. He pulled out his badge and identification and held them up for everyone to see. I'm Special Agent Michael Reynolds, FBI, he said. Clearly, I'm traveling on official business. I paid for this ticket with my personal credit card. I have violated no airline policies or federal regulations. I'm being removed from this flight because your flight attendant made an assumption based on my race. And now, both of you are supporting that discrimination. The color drained from Sarah Collins's face. Jake Morrison's hand dropped from his belt, and Captain Hart stood frozen, staring at the FBI credentials in Reynolds' hand. The first-class cabin went completely silent as Collins stood with her mouth slightly open, staring at the FBI badge and credentials. Morrison took a step backward with his earlier aggression evaporating into visible panic, and Hart's face went from confident authority to pale uncertainty in the span of 3 seconds. Reynolds kept the credentials raised so everyone could see them, the badge gleaming under the cabin lights, and his official FBI identification showing his photo, his title as Special Agent, and his assignment to the Counterterrorism Division, letting the moment hang there, so they could absorb what they had just done. You're FBI, Captain Hart finally managed to say, his voice stripped of its earlier command. Reynolds lowered his credentials, but didn't put them away. Yes, 15 years with the Bureau, Counterterrorism Division. I've spent the last week coordinating intelligence operations across 3 states. I'm carrying classified materials in this bag, which is why I fly first class on official travel. I need privacy to work. I paid $1,400 for this seat because it's worth it to review sensitive documents without someone looking over my shoulder. Collins tried to form words, but nothing came out, and her hands were shaking slightly. Morrison cleared his throat. Sir, I didn't know you were. Reynolds cut him off with a look that could freeze water. You didn't know because you didn't ask. You saw a black man in first class, and you assumed I was the problem. You looked at my valid boarding pass, and still chose to threaten me with physical removal. You told me, you people always say that, like I'm some kind of criminal, instead of federal agent who has dedicated his career to protecting this country. The woman in 2C was still recording everything, her phone steady and pointed directly at the scene, and at least 5 other passengers had their phones out too, documenting it from multiple angles. Hart tried to recover. Sir, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. If we could just... There's no misunderstanding, Reynolds said, his voice cold and precise. Your flight attendant saw me sitting in my assigned seat and decided I didn't belong because of my skin color. She questioned my ticket when it was valid. She questioned whether I paid for first class, as if a black man couldn't possibly afford it. She lied and said I was being disruptive when I was sitting quietly reading. She called security, claiming there was a problem with my ticket, when the only problem was her racism. Collins finally found her voice. I didn't mean I was just doing my job. I didn't know you were. Reynolds turned to her with an expression of absolute contempt. Your job does include racially profiling paying customers. And my being FBI doesn't change what you did. It just means you picked the wrong person to discriminate against. He shifted his attention to Morrison and said that Morrison boarded the plane already treating him like a criminal, dismissed his valid boarding pass, ignored multiple passengers telling him Reynolds had done nothing wrong, threatened a woman for recording evidence of bias, and told Reynolds to stand up or face physical removal even though he had broken no rules and violated no policies, and that Morrison was prepared to drag a federal agent off the plane because a colleague made a racist assumption, and he backed her without question. Morrison had no response and looked at the floor. Reynolds turned back to Captain Hart and said that Hart emerged from the cockpit and made his decision in 5 seconds, didn't ask Reynolds for his side, didn't look at the boarding pass, didn't listen to the passengers telling him it was wrong, and saw his white flight attendant accusing a black passenger and automatically took her side, saying, "That's not command. That's complicity." Hart opened his mouth, but Reynolds wasn't finished. Say he had top secret security clearance, had served the country for 15 years, had worked counterterrorism cases that saved lives, had sat across from actual criminals and actual threats, and today he was treated like one of them because he committed the crime of sitting in first class while black. He paused, looked at all three of them, and said they didn't just profile a passenger, they profiled a federal agent on official travel, that the incident was now a federal matter, and they'd be hearing from his attorney and from the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, and that every passenger in the cabin was a witness. The businessman in 1A spoke up, "I'm an attorney. I'll provide a full statement about everything I witnessed." The woman recording added, "I'm uploading this video the moment we land. The whole world is going to see what you people did." Hart tried one last time. "Sir, we can offer you compensation, a full refund, an upgrade on future flights." Reynolds' laugh was harsh and humorless. "I don't want a refund. I want accountability. I want policy changes. I want mandatory bias training for every employee. I want an independent review of how many other passengers you've done this to and gotten away with it." He looked directly at Collins. "How many other black passengers have you questioned? How many complaints have been filed against you that your airline ignored?" Collins's silence was answer enough. Reynolds sat back down in seat 2A. "This flight is leaving. I'm staying in my seat. If you try to remove me, you'll be forcibly removing a federal agent who has broken no laws. Every phone in this cabin is recording. Make your choice." Gate Supervisor Patricia Green boarded the aircraft within 2 minutes of being radioed about a federal agent involved in a passenger dispute. She was a 20-year airline veteran, and when she walked into first class and saw Captain Hart, Security Officer Morrison, and Flight Attendant Collins standing around a seated black man, holding FBI credentials while multiple passengers recorded, she knew it was a career-ending disaster. "Someone explain what happened here," Green said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. 6 passengers started talking at once as the businessman handed her his business card and said he was an attorney willing to testify. The woman in 2C showed her the video she recorded of the entire interaction, and another passenger had written down timestamps of everything that happened. Green watched 30 seconds of the video, and her face went rigid. She turned to Collins. "You're done. Get off this aircraft immediately and report to my office." Collins's eyes went wide. "But I was just trying to get off now." Green cut her off. "You've created a federal incident." She looked at Morrison. "You're also being reported to your supervisor. Leave." Morrison started to protest, but Green held up one hand. "I watched the video. I heard you threaten passengers. I heard what you said to Agent Reynolds. Go." Both Collins and Morrison left the plane in silence, their careers effectively ending with each step down the jet bridge. Green turned to Captain Hart. "We'll discuss your role in this later. For now, I need you to get this flight to Washington." Then she faced Reynolds. "Sir, on behalf of the airline, I sincerely apologize for what you experienced. This is unacceptable, and there will be full accountability." Reynolds looked at her with zero warmth. "This isn't the first time I've been questioned on your airline for sitting in first class. It's just the first time I'm documenting it officially." He said 3 previous flights over 2 years had flight attendants question his seat assignment, that it only happened in first class, never in economy, and it never happened to white passengers. Green closed her eyes briefly. "How many times?" 3, Reynolds repeated, saying he let it go because he was tired and didn't want a confrontation. But today the employee didn't just question him. She lied about him being disruptive, called security, tried to have him removed, and the captain and security officer backed her without evidence or investigation. He pulled out his phone and said he was filing a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation, filing a federal civil rights lawsuit, and requesting a full investigation into discriminatory practices at the airline. Green nodded slowly and said she understood, and that he'd have full cooperation of their legal department. "I don't want cooperation," Reynolds said coldly. "I want systemic change. saying he wanted every complaint filed by minority passengers over the last 10 years reviewed, mandatory anti-discrimination training, independent oversight, and financial consequences significant enough that the airline never ignored the problem again. The flight departed 47 minutes late. By the time it landed in Washington, the video had been uploaded to social media, and within 6 hours it had 3 million views. Within 24 hours it had 15 million, and the hashtag #FlyingWildBlack was trending nationally. Sarah Collins was terminated within 48 hours for violation of company policy and federal civil rights laws, receiving no severance and no pension, and was effectively blacklisted from the aviation industry, with no other airline willing to hire her, as the video followed her everywhere. Jake Morrison was fired from airport security and faced an internal investigation for threatening passengers and discriminatory conduct, and his personnel file was subpoenaed and revealed 6 previous complaints from minority travelers that had been dismissed without investigation. Captain Dennis Hart was suspended pending investigation and ultimately demoted, stripped of his captain status, and reassigned to ground training duties, with his 30-year career ending not with retirement parties but with shame. The airline's legal team reviewed Reynolds' complaint and discovered a pattern. Over 7 years, 47 formal complaints have been filed by black passengers alleging discrimination in seating, service, and treatment, and 45 of those complaints have been dismissed by HR as misunderstandings or oversensitivity. Internal emails revealed supervisors had been warned about Collins specifically, but took no action because she was efficient and passengers rarely complained twice. Reynolds filed a federal lawsuit seeking $1.2 million in damages, and the airline settled within 4 months rather than face a jury trial. Because the video evidence was too damaging, the pattern of ignored complaints was too clear, and the potential publicity was too destructive. The settlement included mandatory anti-bias training for all flight crews, independent quarterly audits of passenger complaints, a zero-tolerance policy for racial profiling, and the creation of a passenger advocacy office. 23 employees with patterns of discrimination complaints were forced to resign. 5 years later, the video had 50 million views and was used in corporate training seminars worldwide as a case study in the cost of racism. Reynolds used the settlement money to establish a foundation supporting victims of travel discrimination and consulted with airlines on civil rights compliance. Sarah Collins was 38 when she was fired and never worked in aviation again, taking a job in retail, making $14 an hour, while the video never stopped following her. Michael Reynolds continued his FBI career and retired after 25 years of service, and he still flies first class, with airlines treating him with particular care now, terrified of becoming the next viral discrimination story. The lesson was expensive and public. Assumptions about who belongs were based on skin color don't just hurt people. They destroy careers, cost millions, and expose the systemic failures that allowed discrimination to thrive unchecked for years. The script ends by saying that if you believe qualified professionals deserve respect regardless of race, share the story. If you've ever been made to feel like you don't belong somewhere you pay to be, drop your experience in the comments. And if you think billion-dollar companies should face real consequences for tolerating racism, subscribe because they're bringing more stories where justice costs exactly what it should: everything.